About a year and a half ago, Lynn, Dawn, and I talked about the possibility of this conference at another conference that I was involved in organizing, and it was a conference in honor of Sheldon Stryker, another great social psychologist. Lynn gave me some quotes that Sheldon wrote several years ago upon Dave's retirement. I'm not going to read all of it. I'm just going to read one part, quote, that you've now heard at least 2 different times from different generations of sociologists. And so what he said is, Shell wrote, when I think back to when I chaired IU's departments of sociology, my single greatest accomplishment in that role was in the part I played in bringing you, David, into the department. And I think this is a sentiment that many of us in the department have had and continue to have, and certainly a sentiment for this room. So we're going to talk about what was originally called the post-UNC days, and we turned it to the IU days. And what we have, and it's not really IU days, it's IU and beyond. And so what we have is sort of a sampling, a chronological sampling, and also geographical sampling, because we will have one presentation from Germany, from people who have been very strongly influenced by David in many different ways. We're going to start off with one of David's former graduate students at IU, Amy Kroska.
Thank you. So I have visual aids, and I might even need to stand up so I can see them myself. But I first encountered ACT in Shell's social psych class. And I, enjoyed it. And at the end of the semester, wrote a paper on the sociology of emotions for that class. So, oh, okay.
Yeah. That microphone isn't. This one isn't recording.
Okay.
It's this computer that's recording.
Oh, okay. So I need to be louder. Okay. Well, I'll stand up. That'll help me be louder. So I wrote a sociology of emotions paper for that class. And then the next semester, I think the spring of '92, Dave had a sociology of emotions class on the schedule. So I decided I would enroll in that. And I did that even though at this point I was planning to be focused on macro issues and international development. I even started a minor and took a class on the history of sub-Saharan Africa. But I thought, why not? I'll take this sociology of emotions class. And during that class, Dave offered me a pre-doc fellowship with his grant. So I was thrilled by that. I need to move forward. And was very happy to drop all my interests in macro issues and international issues and moved squarely over to the social psych camp. And I have been there ever since. I switched my minor. I didn't care that I had already started it, and my minor became psych. So I took classes in the psych department there. So I was, of course, exposed to ACT in a much bigger way in that class. So here are the 2 books that we read in that class. And as you can see, they are well worn, and I've been reading them, ever since then. More on that a little later. So that semester, as I said, was exposed to ACT in a bigger way. Then a couple of years later, I read Arlie Russell Hochschild's The Second Shift, which is a qualitative study focused on dual learner couples who are juggling the demands of work and family. And I was struck by how much the sort of descriptive findings she presented could be explained by ACT. So her respondents talked about how difficult it was when their work divisions didn't mesh with their gender ideology, and that made them uncomfortable. And I thought that seemed like deflection. And then she also talked about the ways in which couples or spouses would change the way they understood their work division so that it would mesh more with their gender ideology. And that to me sounded like redefining the situation so as to reduce the deflection. So I started working on a dissertation proposal, drawing on my ACT knowledge and applying it to Hochschild's findings and other findings in the housework literature. And eventually I asked Dave if he would share my dissertation, and luckily he agreed. So then we started meeting, and we met in the office weekly, I think. And after a few meetings, one of us decided I should show him what I had written. And so I gave it to him, and he was very supportive. So, but I think the best way to describe those encounters is to use ACT itself. So here we have Interact, and I'm the viewer, Amy, and Dave is you know, the focal person here. I'm using the Indiana data from 0204, which is close to when this was. And I thought of Dave as a brilliant professor.
Boy, there are an awful lot of negative identities up there.
Well, wait, I have to click ahead. So I thought of Dave as a brilliant professor, but brilliant is not a modifier. We need to add that to the dictionary. So I had to settle for intelligent professor, which means that he gets an amalgamated identity, which is quite good and quite powerful and neutral on activity. And I was an insecure graduate student, which gives me an amalgamated identity that's slightly bad, neutral in potency and slightly inactive. So as we, went over these early issues, I expected him, as you can see, to interview or supervise me. But he didn't. Instead, he encouraged me, which created all kinds of deflection and made me feel awestruck, as you can see up here in the upper right. So my emotions are very high on evaluation there. So I tried to bring that deflection down, because of course I was just a lowly insecure graduate student and he was a brilliant professor. So I think at that point I deferred to him, and as you can see, the deflection went down. And then I expected him to supervise or interview me, but he didn't. He encouraged me again, and then the deflection went up again. So I am really taken aback by all of this, and my emotions now are almost off the charts. I'm feeling infinitely good. So I really need to figure out a way to bring this deflection down, I'm thinking. So at this point, I stammered at him, as one would do if you're an insecure graduate student. So I stammered at him, and that did bring the deflection down a little bit. But he continued to act as if I weren't an insecure graduate student, and I think at this point he might have praised me. Oh, my deflection is really going up, and again I'm back to feeling infinitely good. So then at that point, I think I yielded to him. So this is how our early encounters went, and he was, as you can see, exceptionally supportive and unduly supportive and encouraging. So then I worked on my dissertation proposal. He met with me every week and helped me create a very big survey, and I distributed it to people throughout Bloomington and around. And then I wrote out my dissertation, and in total I published 8 pieces out of my dissertation, and Dave had wisely advised me to collect as much data as I could, even data I wasn't sure how I'd use, because it would be useful in the years ahead, and indeed that is how it worked out. So that's my sort of focus on the IU ACT. I went on to continue to use ACT in other projects. So Bernice Pescasolido very generously gave me data that she collected from people who had just been diagnosed with a mental illness. And at the time, Sarah Harkness, who was in the MABA program at Kent State, was my research assistant. Where is Sarah? So she I asked if she wanted to work on some projects with me, and she was game. So we started out just using the ACT measurement tools, EPA ratings, and we used them to operationalize concepts in the modified labeling theory, and we thought maybe improve on the previous ways it had been tested. In our third study, we actually used ACT theory and simulated interactions, and in doing that, attempted to test modified labeling theory predictions about coping behaviors, the way that self-stigmatization predicts coping behaviors. And then more recently, we've done pieces also using ACT, simulating the way stigma affects coping and emotions and interactions and identity adoption. So in that final project, we were drawing on ACT self. And I've also more recently used simulations to help explain the gender gap in business leadership. And with Marshall, I've been working on projects related to using ACT to explain criminal sanctioning. So as you can see from this lineup, ACT is valuable for illuminating countless processes from housework divisions to stigma to coping to the gender gap in business leadership and even to criminal sanctioning. So I also wanted to note that we graduate students at IU sought to emulate our mentors, both Dave and Shell. So Dave is a brilliant methodologist, and all of us who studied under him sought to be good methodologists. Dave is also a phenomenal computer programmer who has created Interact, and so we tried to use Interact in our work to illuminate processes. And the same is true with Shell's students. So Shell is an insightful theorist who illuminated the way that social structure affects the individual, and his students attempted to do that in their work as well. And Shell was knowledgeable about a wide array of social psych literatures, and his students tried to follow in his footsteps by learning a broad array of literatures. So given all of that, it may not be a surprise that there is an almost perfect correlation between the theory that we graduate students use, ACT or IT, identity theory, and our status as a smoker. So here is a 2x2 table. And so the data point I initially had a hard time with was James Lee. So I emailed him and I said, I know you, well, first I told him about the 2x2 table, so he would know why I was asking this. I said, I know you smoke sometimes, but did you see yourself as a smoker or a non-smoker? And he said, well, this is a quote from his email. The funny thing is, I was both a smoker and a non-smoker, which may explain why I dabbled in both IT and HC. So I broke all kinds of data coding rules and put him in here twice. And I put him in the cell that I wanted to put him in as a smoker and as a non-smoker, so you can see him there. And then yesterday I talked to Lisa, and I had forgotten actually initially to have you in here. And Lisa, I said, so were you a smoker? She said, yeah, we all smoked. But then she said, but I did later quit. But, I also drew on identity theory. So I could have perhaps also put her in this other cell. So I ran a t-test. And I don't have data on my laptop. So last night I would have added Lisa to the data set and rerun it, but I couldn't. So so this my t-test doesn't reflect Lisa's addition to the data set. So this is what I want. Here are Dave's books, and took a picture of them. So in part to provide a visual aid to highlight how much ACT has been central to my research and my teaching. So all of these are well worn, and this is exactly how they were when I pulled them off the shelf. And then here's a picture of all of my ACT related books, also well worn. So as you can imagine, I could toss a couple of these books and just replace them, but I wouldn't want to do that because I would lose all the scribbles in the margins, and there are a lot of them. So I thought, well, I better make this concrete and show you exactly what I mean. So all of these books have lots of markings in the margins, but the one that probably has the most action is Lynn's impression from events. So here is that table, and you can see here my markings became so numerous that I had to start color coding them so I could distinguish between one paper and another. So, you know, a red check mark was one paper, a blue check mark another paper. And then I also started to date my comments. So up here in the upper left, this Rob VOC is Rob versus overcharge for a paper with Marshall, where we were trying to figure out what would be the prediction for robbing versus overcharging someone in a vignette. And so that's a recent one, dated 10/17/16. Here's some more. The M's and W's are men and women. And my dating pattern started early, as I've noticed here, the 797, that's about a month before I defended my dissertation. So I was already needing ways to distinguish between these different markings. So in closing, I'll just say that in my estimation, ACT is an infinitely good and infinitely potent and active theory, and Dave has inspired a powerful group of researchers, as this conference shows, and we all will continue to extend and develop it.
I have to make one comment. Lynn complained endlessly about my cigars.
I just wanted to live forever, you know? I remember you used to say that Grimshaw used to smoke in support of him in faculty meetings.
I tried to get him to stop smoking because I was afraid he wasn't going to make it to my defense.
But the cigars were much stinkier than the cigarettes.
And I knew you were into cigarettes.
Yeah.
Cigarettes.
Well, maybe I had some impact.
You did quit at one point while I was at IU because you gave me a carton of cigarettes. You said, it was the national or natural spirit, I think. Yeah. So he said, "Are you still smoking?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, I've quit, so I'm going to give you this carton," and you explained how healthy these were compared to other cigarettes.
Well, I feel like I should start my talk by talking about how Peggy was actually smoking a pipe at Vanderbilt in order to break the roll. She started with rolled cigarettes and she went to pipe smoking. It was quite impressive. Okay, I came to IU. I think as part of the post-smoking crowd. It was in 2000, and I recall that was the year that Dave was teaching his last social psych course because he was retiring. Little did I know at the time that retiring in Dave's world meant writing 4 books, only one of which was a summary of one of his many lifetime achievements. The other 3, I think it was just 3, thank you, Amy, were actually completely new lines of research. And so now that I know him better, I'm not surprised, and I must say that Dave has single-handedly shifted my personal understanding of EPA of to retire to be high E, super high P, and active and higher still A. So good for you, and thank you for raising the bar for the rest of us. Unlike many of you, I wasn't trained as a graduate student in the ins and out of ACT. Indeed, when I arrived at Ballantine Hall, most of what I knew about ACT was limited to what I had somehow haphazardly managed to fit into my special area exam in a section titled Theories of Identity, which held, as you might imagine, the big three: role theory, Shell's identity theory, and affect control theory. And I must admit, at the time, the first two were the ones that seemed the most intuitive and the most relevant. Although there was something about ACT that was intriguing, albeit at the purely theoretical level. And yes, Peggy Thoitz, my advisor, had taught ACT in her social psych class, but frankly, I just didn't get it. Though in retrospect, I remember sitting around on the stairs with one of my classmates and talking about it. And I was honest. I said, you know, I really didn't get it, but it seemed super cool. And that was, of course, high praise of an uninitiated grad student, if a relatively uninformed assessment of the work. So I'll be honest, it was the numbers and the equations, especially the equations, that did me in, like many self-professed qualitative researchers before me. And in fact, the only things that I had read prior to coming to IU were a couple of Heise's articles of the 3 dimensions of affective space, Neil's affect control theory of symbolic interaction, Linda Francis's work on identity management and social support, and I think I might have read one of the Britton Heise collaborations. Classics? Yes. Comprehensive? No. So one of the reasons I came to IU to begin with is that most of my graduate training was in qualitative methods, and even though I was an ethnographer interviewer at my heart of hearts, I really wanted to be better versed in statistics, mainly so that I could comment on other people's work and understand it. That, and I figured that taking a stats class with a PhD was going to be a heck of a lot stressful than taking a class without a PhD. And I was right. And because it was there, and it was relatively clean and easy to use, and it had lots of information on emotion, I started using the GSS emotions module. And I'm super glad that Serenity is still using it. So I think I must have said something to Lynn about it at a conference honoring Shell's work, or maybe Brian made the connection. But the very first social psych brown bag in the spring semester of 2001, this very distinguished looking gentleman who had been away on sabbatical during the fall walked casually around the table and introduced himself. But I knew who he was based on the quality and nature of the questions, because he had been deviling Shell in the course of the presentation. Hi, I'm Dave Heise. I understand you're doing some work on the GSS emotions module. Well, at that point, that was a very generous interpretation of what was happening. I was willing to let that slide. Then he said he was also working with that module, asked whether I would be willing to send him what I was working on, if I would maybe take a look at what he was working on, and maybe have a discussion about maybe we should work on it together. I think I swallowed my tongue at that point, simply nodded, and ran to Brian's office. The next year and a half I spent with Dave and with Brian and Jane were transformative to my personal growth as a scholar. And I'd like to flatter myself to think that it was at least partially transformative to ACT and the sociology of emotion writ large. So that said, over the course of our working relationship, Dave and I only collaborated twice. And those writings were 10 years apart. That 10 years, however, spanned many conversations, much freely given insight, usually one directional, and a deep modeling about how someone could navigate the world, not only writing and theorizing about ACT, but by truly viewing the world and understanding events through that lens. The first paper was published in AJS, Sociological Realms of Emotion, where we actually did do some work with the emotions module. And it goes without saying that Dave's half was much more technical than my half, and it proved to be the first confirmation of the presence of the 3 effective dimensions of meaning upon which ACT is based, using nationally representative survey data of individuals' self-reported emotional experiences. And while that comes as no surprise to anybody in this room, it finally put to bed, finally, all of those critiques about small sample sizes, convenient samples, and GASP, the ratings of emotion words. He also began thinking seriously about what he called emotional stations, which were those places that individuals tend to occupy within a 7-day period in the 3-dimensional affective space. These were derived by plotting unique configurations of the sentiments that characterize those individual emotional experiences within that said affective space. And they tended to correlate in interesting and surprising ways with a variety of social structural conditions, which provided another important piece of the puzzle of how social structure is linked to everyday emotional life. The second half, which was decidedly less technical, was the initial iteration of what later became known as emotional segue theory, which I later expanded upon in a subsequent social forces. Those two works, with Dave's patience, wisdom, and guidance, allowed me to bring together my old love, qualitative symbolic interaction approaches to emotion management, and my new flame, ACT, again, using nationally representative data. Although the HAS was the only piece that I worked on with Dave while I was at IU, the magnitude of his influence on me and my thinking about emotion and emotion management was pervasive and began sneaking into all of my other collaborations. And I'm perhaps most proud of the fact that it was through these collaborations that Brian Powell, who started this conference, landed not only his first, but also his second citation on the ACT reading list hosted on the ACT websites. Working with Brian, influenced by Dave, we began setting up testable hypotheses which pit various formal theories of emotion and social psych against one another in areas of work and family, division of household labor, and other patterns of inequality in the home. Without casting shade on any non-ACTers out there who might be misguided enough to be wedded to other theories, guess who won? Like every single time. We also used Interact to develop interesting new insights that have been missing in these other theories, especially equity theory and the theory previously known as ICT. My unconventional approach to using Interact has been passed on to my one intellectual student on the board, Celeste Campos Castillo, who is now taking on her former favorite theory of choice, status characteristics theory. I also began sneaking references to ACT into theoretical chapters with Jane McLeod as a possible vector to reimagine, reinvigorate, and recast social structure and personality as a vibrant paradigm that has the yet unrealized capacity to deal with processes and change. And I also snuck it into this relatively minor chapter on health and identity, written with Carrie Smith, a qualitative researcher at Millersville. It was that seemingly inconsequential chapter that first brought Jesse into my life and into the community. I remember getting an email in my office at Green School from a hotshot computational scientist who was just beginning to think how maybe sociological identity theories might be relevant to his work on Alzheimer's. Boy, am I glad I answered that email. Having then been away for over a decade, Dave invited me to return to Bloomington in 2012 to start working on our second collaboration, a chapter on ACT and emotion, which was published in John and Jan's Handbook, Sociology of Emotion, Volume 2. I was super nervous. Spend a week with Dave at IU working on a chapter in real time, like seriously? And all of a sudden, I was that nervous first-year graduate postdoc who was gonna go sit at the feet of the Buddha. I mean, I was petrified. My imposter identity was up there. Think about it. Imposter collaborates with Buddha. I met Dave outside the coffee shop there on the town square. He seemed super happy to see me and also completely oblivious to the amount of deflection I was experiencing. I'm so excited, he said, rocking back on his heels. It's not often that I get to spend a week with such a renowned emotions scholar at ACT. It was my turn to rock back. I tried that on and realized it felt much better than what I had been wearing. I took a deep breath as the truth washed over me. Not that I thought he was correct, mind you, but the simpler truth, the more profound truth, which is no one, and I mean no one, can reframe an event quite like Dave Heise. I decided to go with it, and sure enough, my emotions changed accordingly. For those of you who haven't read that handbook chapter, or maybe it was on your special area exam, or maybe you skimmed it once on the plane or in the bath, it's a gold mine that has been largely left untapped. In it, we systematically lay out all the ways in which ACT scholars, that is you, have contributed to the core development of the sociology of emotion. We also illustrate beyond a shadow of a doubt, at least from our perspectives, that ACT and emotion management are profoundly linked, as Linda Francis pointed out all those years ago, that identity processes and emotion management processes go hand in hand. And we do that by illustrating many of our key empirical points using the scholarship of folks who would never, ever, ever in a million years consider themselves to be associated with affect control theory, and who would never even pretend or try to understand it. Although I feel like I should end this by making a poignant theoretical note or a plea for a second emotions module that would allow us to more effectively mine the 2014 chapter, I'm going to actually share a story about my favorite moment of writing that chapter with Dave. And I really literally mean with Dave, because it happened when we were sitting side by side, shoulder to shoulder, on his couch, each typing diligently into our shared Google document. No pressure there, folks. Trust me. I had just finished highlighting a huge section of text when I was just about to hit Command X. Dave reached over, touched my hand. If you hit delete, I will break your arm. Because every time you do that, the whole page jumps. And I lose my place. I did not hit delete. He did not break my arm. And he did not, and I dare say will not, lose his place. There, here, ever, in the lives of everyone in this room, and in the larger discourse about what it means to be humans who live our lives in roles, thinking that we have a self, and who move in and out of events. So thank you, Dave, for creating a model of human interaction and self that is so simple, yet so nimble, that it not only has kept so many of us occupied for decades, but obviously has the capacity to continue doing so for decades to come. You are the best.
Yeah.
Are you going to show Tobias first? Or?
No, you're
I'm
You're
next.
next.
Oh, okay. Right. Well, I don't have any. Didn't prepare too much for this, so I guess I'll just rewind and tell a little bit of the story about how I got involved in it. I was did my PhD in computer vision, and I worked on facial expressions of emotion, which in computer science and artificial intelligence is largely people trying to recognize the difference between happiness and sadness, and based on Ekman's theory of basic emotions and things like that. And I kind of always knew that there was something else going on, and there was a small trickle of work that was describing emotions within the artificial intelligence community, describing emotions as being communicative signals that people could send to one another. And there was some sort of ideas floating around that they were performative signals, so that you're sort of telling somebody else what to do. And so then I sort of sat on that for a while after the PhD, and I started working on this dementia stuff. And then I always kind of had this sensation that there was something going on in my attempt to create artificial intelligence that had to do with people sort of knowing what was going on in other people's minds, right? And I didn't really know how to get at that. And I sort of had some vague, crazy theories about ESP. I thought maybe that was the right way to go. And then I was at Waterloo, and I gave a talk. There was a philosopher, a professor of philosophy there, Paul Thagard, and he would hold this event every year called Ignorance Day. And he invited people to come to Ignorance Day and speak about something that they didn't know anything about. Right? So it was a way of kind of stirring up the interdisciplinary pot and getting everybody kind of talking about crazy things. And a lot of people didn't really take it on very well. They'd go and talk about their research and things like that. And so I went and showed up and gave a talk about my idea about, it was just like a 5-minute talk saying that, you know, it was extrasensory perception. And you can't really talk about, you're thinking about ESP in any place other than Paul Thagard's Ignorance Day. And then this guy came up to me after my talk, and he came up, and remember him walking down the aisle, and he pointed to me and said in a thick German accent, "I know the answer to your question." And that was Tobias Schröder. And then he said, "Oh, we should go and sit down. I'll tell you all about this." And I was, you know, going up for tenure that year, so I was like, "No, I'm really busy. I can't do that." He said, "Come on, you really got to sit down. I got to tell you about it." I said, "Okay, fine." So we had lunch, and he told me about it and pointed me to Dave's book, and which I sort of put aside, and because I was, you know, trying to get tenure. I didn't want to get distracted, which was a good idea in hindsight. And then finally picked the book up again after about a year later and started reading through Expressive Order. And I spent the first half just made no sense to me at all. And I was struggling through it. And I like to read books that make no sense to me. So I just keep going, just letting the words flow in. Hopefully something's going to happen. And then I finally get to the middle of the book and turn the page and see that where the math starts. And then within one page, I was like, "Oh, I understand this now. That's exactly the answer to my question."
So how about other people experience?
I know. I think, yeah, I've heard that from sociologists, that it's the other way around. Anyways, that was the start of a really remarkable transformation for me. I really felt that it changed everything, and it sort of completely took over all of my work and became this dominant force in what I was doing. And then Tobias and I came down here and met. So I met Dave. I guess it was in 2012 or something, 2013 maybe. And it was the winter, we got here around Christmas time, and there was a big snowstorm, and we were supposed to come out to Dave's place and in the country, but he said, "No, you can't do that, it's too dangerous." So he drove in, and we'd meet in the breakfast room at the Grant Street Inn every day, and it was just an incredible experience. Those couple of days was really something. I asked a bunch of the questions that we had, and really helped with developing the first sort of phase of Bayes Act, I guess, and then went back and wrote a couple of papers about it and got some publications out and got the basic ideas going. And I kept on hammering at the artificial intelligence door with this idea, and just basically got nowhere, you know? Very, very difficult sell in artificial intelligence. And I think one of the reasons is that artificial intelligence has kind of, I would say, sort of split into two pieces now. One is a very operational discipline, which has essentially been co-opted by engineers. So it's really about building computers to solve really hard problems that humans can't solve, okay? Like driving a car, for instance, right? So that's something that humans are terrible at, and then computers are actually really good at doing it. If they're the only ones on the road, of course. But anyways, then there's the other branch, which is, I think, the more traditional artificial intelligence, which is, or the original sort of conceptualization of it, which was, how do humans deal with each other and how do they make decisions? And I think that's where affect control theory really could make a major difference in AI. And I've really had a hard time sort of pitching this to people in artificial intelligence, in part because of this giant sort of push towards this really operational version of AI, where it is doing remarkable things, right? I mean, you can get now computers to do things that we never thought would be possible in the past. And then, so recently then I ran into, again, so Tobias, out of the blue, emails me this video of a neuroscientist at University College London by the name of Carl Friston, who's very well known in neuroscience. He's did some very seminal work on brain imaging. And he has a theory that I spoke a bit about yesterday about free energy and the creation of order, and the way in which that can be a fundamental model for the way that the human brain works. And as I tried to express yesterday, I really think that the affect control theory and deflection is a measure of free energy at a level in the brain that fits almost perfectly into a slot in this free energy theory that they didn't have the piece for. And so I emailed Carl Friston and said, can I come meet you? And he said he looked at the paper, and I think it piqued his interest. And so I went and met with him at UCL about a month ago, and he was right on board. He was so receptive to it. So I was like, finally, somebody because he now works in AI, like he does a lot of work in AI. It's not very well accepted because it's really one of these human AIs. It's not the sort of operational definition of AI. But essentially, he's like, that's exactly the piece we need, right? It fits perfectly into that framework. And so I think the vision that you had of seeing that connection, essentially, and that's why I was asking Lynn yesterday about the square. Why was it, oh no, Dawn, why was it squared? Why is deflection squared? Because that gives it exactly that definition of energy that fits perfectly into that framework, right? If you'd made it an L1 norm, if you'd made it an absolute value, then I would have had to say, well, it probably is squared. So for some reason, deflection is squared, and that actually makes it into this energy term, right? So all these pieces fit together, and I think that this may be the way forward. And one of the things that I talked to Carl Friston about artificial intelligence in general and deep learning, which is the current sort of fad in AI, and he said, yeah, I think that he speaks in a very elegant English accent, which I can't replicate, but he said, yeah, he said, deep learning is like a giant oil tanker going in the wrong direction. And he said, he's like a little tugboat saying, hey guys, it's over here. So anyways, I think that the two theories I'm completely convinced that they can be united, and they seem to be on board with this idea as well. So I'm hoping that I'm now going to expand the reach of affect control theory beyond to people in AI that are actually receptive to it at this point. So
let me just mention a couple of things here. One is, I think I can't see how they can ignore something like ACT when they start talking about conscious robotics. Consciousness.
Yeah.
And so that's, to me, seems, and there's more talk in that direction now.
Yeah.
As far as the square, this goes all the way back to me sitting in the library at the University of Chicago as a grad student and making little graphs of how do people respond to violations of norms, and it was a parabola.
Okay. Yeah, so there's something about the fact that there's what you were saying is as you move out to these higher differences, the effects become much larger, right? It's not a linear relationship.
Yeah.
Which is exactly what, when you pull a pendulum back, the energy, the potential energy that's stored goes up like the square, right? So it has this relationship to the physical nature of the world or the universe that's really remarkable. I think. So it's very visionary, I'd say. So, but you're saying just empirically, just looked at the data. So yeah, so I think that's it. That's all I have to say. But thank you very much.
And finally, from Germany, I always thought it was Tobias, but I guess it's Tobias.
In Germany, it is.
In Germany, okay.
I called him Tobias for the first 3 years, and then he finally corrected me. Yeah.
So, and there he is.
Do we need to do anything with the sound? Because I don't know.
I think it's okay. But
No,
I'm
we
not
have to-
sure.
We need to
No, we
stop
have
the
to- no,
recording
okay.
on my computer, perhaps, because.
We can leave the recording on your computer.
Okay.
Yeah. But we just need to turn the microphone on.
Yeah.
Hey friends, for those who don't know me, I'm Tobias Schröder. I'm a social psychologist based in Potsdam in Germany, and I have contributed a few things to ACT. So Lynn asked me to say a few words on this panel about internationality and interdisciplinarity. Unfortunately, I couldn't make it to the conference for the second time in a row. This is the second ACT conference in a row that I'm missing. It's very sad. But I have a family reunion this weekend, which had been planned a long time before and that I didn't want to miss. But technology like this video allows us to be able to communicate anyway. And Dave, I'm sure there's nobody who appreciates technology in this regard more than Dave does, because he was kind of a pioneer in using the internet in doing research, even across the globe, and bringing together a community. In fact, Dave was a bit something like a remote, unofficial co-supervisor of my PhD thesis at the time. It was very kind and generous of him. I think I will never forget the moment when I, as a very timid graduate student, sent out this email to Dave and telling him about my plans for dedicating my PhD work to ACT and asking for some help. And I wondered if I'd ever get a reply. And I think it did not even take an hour. And there was this email back and saying how delighted he was that I was interested in this kind of work, and that he would do anything he could to help me get this going. And he did. Well, here you can see a screenshot of the German Project Magellan website. I hope you noticed the futuristic design, and if you don't believe me, you should just have a look at Jesse's current website.
I think we're supposed to go look at Jesse's website.
Yeah, I mean, the video's still rolling, so I think he wants you to read this.
Back it up.
Data collection where ACT data was collected. As far as I know, that was the first ever data collection where ACT data was collected over the internet, which may sound a bit trivial.
He forgot to turn on his mic. So yeah, there's nothing there.
But at the time it wasn't. In my master's thesis, just a couple years before that, I had still worked with good old-fashioned pencil and paper and the postal service. Now it's really remarkable if you realize that nowadays we're actually working on not asking people at all anymore, but rather using algorithms to extract meaning data and perhaps also impression formation data from the social web. And all that just within a few years. And if I think about the fact that I'm still pretty much in the first half of my career, you sometimes wonder where this is going to end up. But I don't want to talk too much about this connection between social science and computer science, because you have Jesse there and he can do a much better job at this than I can. But instead, in my brief remarks here, highlight some of the connections with cognitive science and psychology. In a way, this is going back to the early years. because the major roots of affect control theory are actually maybe even more in psychology than in sociology. So on this slide, you can see my depiction, which I showed to undergraduate students, of Heise's balance theory, which is one of the first formalized theories of attitude consistency. And Dave once told me, I hope I remember this correctly, that in one of the first manuscripts when he attempted to publish ACT, it was actually called attitude control theory. So the contemporary version of attitude balance is in psychology and cognitive science is parallel constraint satisfaction. And in my postdoc work with Paul Fagart at the University of Waterloo in Canada, where I also happened to meet Jesse, I developed sort of an ACT implementation in a connectionist constraint satisfaction network, which you can see here on this slide. And we used this model to simulate the results of a series of important but also a bit controversial experiments in social psychology, psychological social psychology, which is called priming. And the priming experimental paradigm shows that it is sufficient to activate or subconsciously, sometimes even activate social concepts in people's minds to elicit slight changes in their behavior. Like in the example that you can see on this slide, when you activate the concept rude, the trait rude in a person's mind, then they happen to interrupt an experimenter with much higher likelihood than when you activate the concept polite, which is something you can model very well with this modern Heiderian ACT type model that we developed.
Now, talking of interdisciplinarity, my own discipline, psychology, seems to be moving more towards biology and medicine these days and away from social science, which is also legitimate because people are not just social beings and cognitive information processing systems, but also biological systems. So,
Oh, the system's shutting down. I don't know why. It says, please wait for system shutdown. Hey, that shouldn't have happened. I don't know. Okay.
Hard to think of an idea. Yeah.
What I'm going to try to get them to do is put us a white thing. There you go.
Go back.
Right again, maybe it took a second to reset the sound.
Did somebody give me, should somebody 345? Yeah. Yeah, I don't.
It's on. It needs to be turned on.
systems, but also biological systems. So the question that I was interested in is, can we take a theory such as ACT to unite those three different levels of explanation? And this turned out to be very challenging. So it took us many, many years to get this work into a format that was acceptable to peer reviewers. But this year, 2019, we managed to publish actually 2 studies that bring together ACT and neuroscience. The first is another modeling paper. We took the semantic pointer architecture, which is a framework developed by Kroska at the University of Waterloo for modeling cognitive processes in biologically realistic neurons. And what you can see here on this slide is a simulation of the event that a mother shouts at the child, so a typical ACT simulation. And our model predicts that if that happens, the mother is angry and the child fearful. Now, what's remarkable about that prediction is that it's computed by thousands of artificial neurons that have realistic biological properties. So you could say, in a way, it's an interact that works more like an artificial brain. But we've also done some empirical work on putting together ACT and neuroscience. And it's funnily, the first preliminary results of these of this work were presented at the ACT conference 2012 in Indiana. And there you can see how long it sometimes takes in science to get something really done. So this work came only out this year in January. What we did there is create different event descriptions that differ in their deflection. And then we were able, then we recorded EEG data from the subjects who were supposed to read these event descriptions. And we were able to successfully connect the deflection in those event descriptions with several EEG properties that are related in the literature to semantic mismatch. So we have basically a biological correlate of deflection. So that was my brief tour to ACT and cognitive science. Now, we know very well that humans have a tendency to draw boundaries around their communities. That's very much true these days in global politics, but also in science. And we shouldn't forget that these boundaries are artificial, and the problems often do not respect the boundaries. That's as true in politics as it is in science. So I think what I like most about ACT is that it's a wonderful tool to transcend the borders between disciplines. And we absolutely need to do that if we want to understand something as incredibly challenging as human social interaction. So thank you, Dave, for creating such a wonderful tool for us. And we all promise to cherish it. I wish you a wonderful conference. Bye.